There is a version of the fairy that most of us grew up with, small, sparkling, and endlessly kind, the sort of creature that helps a lost child find the way home or leaves a coin under a pillow in exchange for a lost tooth. That version is comforting, and it is also almost entirely false. The word fairy was never a name for one single species of creature. It was closer to a warning label, a term ordinary people used for anything that lived near them, did not belong to the human world, and could turn on them the moment they showed carelessness or disrespect. That single fact explains why fairy stories feel so contradictory. In one tale, a fairy blesses a farmer with endless good fortune, and in the next tale, a fairy from the very same region drowns a traveler without a shred of mercy. Two images tend to dominate how people picture fairies today, and they sit at opposite ends of the same spectrum. The first is the miniature glowing type, barely taller than a hand, with wings borrowed from a butterfly or a dragonfly, and a personality built entirely around charm and helpfulness. This version owes almost everything to early animated cinema and to children's illustrators of the 19th and early 20th centuries, who wanted fairies to feel gentle and safe for young audiences. The second image is far less innocent, a tall, breathtaking, and thoroughly inhuman figure, ruling over a court bound by ancient and merciless rules, offering power to those who serve, but always at a price steeper than it first appears. Of these two, the second is far closer to what older folklore actually describes. Real traditional fairies were rarely tiny. They were usually imagined as human-sized or larger, living in a parallel world that pressed up against our own, following their own strict logic that had nothing to do with human ideas of fairness. They rewarded courtesy and punished insult with equal precision, and they treated broken promises, spoken carelessly or otherwise, as binding contracts, no matter the human's intention. Even the sweetest of the miniature fairies has a darker origin than most people realize. In the very story that popularized her, the tiny glowing fairy was written as a creature so small she could only hold one emotion at a time, and when that emotion turned to jealousy or anger, she became genuinely dangerous, even attempting to harm the story's young heroine. That detail rarely survives into modern retellings because a homicidal fairy does not sell well to children. So where did the friendlier, safer version come from, and why did the older, stranger tradition get pushed into the shadows? To answer that, we have to go back centuries before glitter and wings, into a world where calling a spirit by the wrong name could genuinely put your household at risk. Long before English speakers ever used the word fairy, the people of early medieval England already lived alongside beings they called elves. Records from the Anglo-Saxon period are thin and scattered, but what survives paints a picture far darker than the elegant elves of later fantasy. These beings were frequently blamed for sudden illness in people and in livestock, and old medical texts describe treatments for something called elf shot, an invisible strike believed to cause sharp, unexplained pain. Even personal names built from the word elf carried an uneasy double meaning, sometimes suggesting protection, sometimes suggesting a need to appease something dangerous. In one of the oldest surviving English poems, elves are grouped together with monsters and giants as descendants of a cursed lineage, which tells us plainly that early English belief did not treat them as gentle woodland spirits. It was only after the Norman conquest that clearer, more fairy-like accounts began appearing regularly in written sources. Chroniclers of the 12th and 13th centuries recorded stories of humans stumbling into hidden realms ruled by small, beautiful, and unnervingly calm people who had no interest in human food, human religion, or human weapons. One frequently retold account describes a boy who fled a harsh tutor, hid beside a riverbank, and was led through a dark passage into an underground world lit by no sun and no stars, yet strangely pleasant all the same. He lived among its inhabitants for a time, learned their language, and eventually made the mistake of stealing a golden ball and running for the surface. The theft sealed every entrance shut behind him, and though he grew old and became a respected clergyman, he never stopped mourning the lost language and the lost world he could never return to. As English folklore developed regionally rather than nationally, distinct local beings took shape. In the western counties, people spoke of small, quick-tempered pixies who delighted in leading travelers in useless circles at night, a fate locals described as being pixie-led, curable only by simple tricks like turning one's coat inside out. Elsewhere, households told stories about helpful domestic spirits who cleaned, repaired, and labored through the night in exchange for nothing more than a bowl of cream, provided nobody made the fatal error of offering them clothing as payment, an act that always drove them away for good and occasionally turned them hostile. Alongside these lighter tales sat a genuinely grim belief, the idea of the changeling, a sickly, strange, or unusually knowing infant secretly swapped for a healthy human child. Families across England and Ireland developed folk methods meant to expose a changeling, and, tragically, this belief caused real suffering to real children with disabilities or illness who were mistaken for something otherworldly. The most documented and devastating case occurred in Ireland in the year 1895, when a woman named Bridget Cleary, suffering from what was very likely a serious respiratory illness, died after being subjected to violent, so-called cures, meant to force a changeling to reveal itself and return the real Bridget. Her death remains one of the clearest, most sobering reminders that fairy belief was never purely whimsical entertainment. It shaped real decisions, real fears, and, in the worst instances, real tragedy, long before any of it became bedtime reading. Crossing into Wales, the fairy tradition takes on a more focused and consistent shape, centered heavily around the so-called fair family, a name deliberately chosen out of politeness, since calling these beings anything less flattering was thought to invite their anger. Wales is especially known for its stories of lake maidens, beautiful women tied permanently to a single body of water, generous toward humans at first, but bound by conditions that seem simple only until someone breaks them. The most detailed of these tales concerns a young cattle herder who spots a strikingly beautiful woman gliding across the surface of a lake beneath a mountain. He offers her bread, first baked too hard, then completely raw, and only on the third attempt, baked exactly right, does she finally accept it and agree to consider marriage. Her father sets a test, asking the young man to pick her out from among identical sisters, and he succeeds by noticing a small detail in how she fastens her sandal. Their marriage brings him extraordinary wealth in cattle and land, but comes with one binding rule. If he ever strikes her 3 times without genuine cause, she and everything she brought with her will return to the water forever. Years pass, children are born, and then, through 3 small, almost accidental taps meant only to hurry her along at a christening, a wedding, and a funeral, the condition is broken. She calls her livestock by name, and every animal, living and long since slaughtered, rises and follows her back beneath the surface, leaving her husband with nothing but the lesson that fairy generosity always carries fine print. Crossing further west into Ireland, the fairy tradition grows even older and considerably grander in scale. The beings most commonly translated as fairies there are described as the people of the mounds, closely tied to the ancient burial and ceremonial sites scattered across the Irish landscape. According to Irish legend, these beings descended from an earlier divine race defeated by the ancestors of the Irish people, and rather than vanishing, they withdrew into the hollow hills, becoming the otherworldly neighbors still spoken of today. This origin gives Irish fairy belief a weight the English and Welsh traditions rarely reach, since these are not simple nature spirits, but the remnants of an older mythological order. Among the most recognizable figures is a woman whose mournful cry is said to warn certain families of an approaching death, appearing sometimes as a young woman and sometimes as an aged figure combing her hair beside a window. Equally striking is a headless rider dressed entirely in black, carrying his own head under one arm, whose silent approach is considered a certain sign that death is near for whoever he names. Alongside these are shape-shifting tricksters capable of appearing as a horse, a goat, or even a person, sometimes leading travelers on a wild and muddy ride purely for amusement, though a few versions of this creature are said to offer honest warnings instead. Perhaps the most telling detail of Irish fairy belief survives in modern behavior rather than old manuscripts, since builders and homeowners across rural Ireland still occasionally reroute a planned road or leave a single hawthorn tree standing rather than risk disturbing ground believed to belong to the fair folk. Scotland pushes the entire tradition into sharper, more dramatic territory, largely because Scottish belief divides fairies into two opposing courts rather than treating them as a single, unpredictable group. One court leans toward fairness, rewarding honesty and hospitality, while still remaining far from harmless. And the other court exists almost entirely to torment, striking travelers with sudden illness or dragging them into genuine danger without any provocation at all. This split between a more benevolent court and a hostile one does not appear with the same clarity in English or Welsh belief, which makes Scottish folklore feel noticeably more structured, almost like a set of rival kingdoms operating side by side. One of the most feared images tied to the hostile court is a nighttime host that sweeps across the sky like a sudden storm, sometimes mistaken for nothing more than high wind, though anyone caught directly in its path risked being carried off entirely. People who heard its passing were advised to bar their doors, cover their windows, and simply wait until the sound faded before stepping back outside. Household spirits appear here too, performing farm labor through the night in exchange for small offerings of milk or oatcakes, and just as in England, insulting one with a gift of clothing guaranteed its permanent and often bitter departure. Scotland's waterways carry their own uniquely dangerous residents, most famously a shape-shifting horse that appears along rivers and lochs, luring travelers, and especially children, onto its back before charging into deep water, from which no rider ever returns. A close and even more feared relative haunts freshwater lochs directly, and old warnings insisted that anyone spotting an unfamiliar horse grazing peacefully near still water should walk away without a second glance. Softer, though no less tragic, are the seal folk associated with the Northern Islands, gentle beings who live as seals in the water but can shed their skin to walk on land as humans. Many stories describe a man hiding a seal woman's skin to keep her from returning to the sea, and though she may live on land for years, raise children, and seem content, the moment she recovers her hidden skin, she returns to the water without hesitation, leaving her human family behind for good. Taken together, these traditions from England, Wales, Ireland, and Scotland reveal something far more coherent than a random collection of scary bedtime stories. They describe communities of people living beside landscapes they respected and, in many cases, genuinely feared, using these tales to enforce caution around unfamiliar ground, unfamiliar animals, and unfamiliar promises. The lesson repeated across almost every single story is remarkably consistent. Treat the unknown with courtesy. Never assume a bargain works in your favor simply because the wording sounds harmless, and never underestimate how steep the price of carelessness can be. So the next time you hear about fairies leaving coins under a pillow, remember that the same folklore also produced headless riders, drowning horses, and grieving women who cry beneath windows to mark an approaching death. Which of these traditions from your own region have you heard growing up, and did the fairy in your family's stories seem kind, or did it seem like something you were taught never to cross? Leave your answer in the comments, and if you want more deep dives into the folklore behind the legends we think we already know, subscribe for the next episode.